So what we're going to do today is really give you a framework to make you all more confident in terms of your monetization. So I remember from yesterday, we have a really, really good mix of folks. Some folks are, much younger in their kind of company trajectory. Some folks are a little more in growth mode, and some folks have kind of had those startup days kind of past them. So we're going to go through a lot of tactics to hopefully help everyone at their different stages. But to give you some context on who we are, who I am in particular, and who gives me a little bit of authority to talk about this, I've run a company called Price Intelligently for the past 4 years. My background's in econometrics and math, and essentially what we do is we help other software companies make more money through pricing. So we have 2 sets of software. One focuses on gathering customer research data and then using that research data to essentially give you kind of guidance on your pricing. And the other is a financial metrics analytic product that basically helps you understand your metrics from a financial perspective. So that's the driest thing in this entire presentation, hopefully. Very different than Jackass Penguins, I will admit. But I'm not telling you this to kind of sell you here. The reason I'm telling you this is basically because we've seen inside more software companies from a financial perspective than anyone else out there. We just had this unique opportunity based on the software that we have that we've seen inside about 20% of the actual financial market when it comes to particular for software. And the reason that's prudent is, and to set this up a little bit, is because what we found in particular for working with a lot of these companies is that a lot of us, I should say, are way too focused on this concept of acquisition as the main driver of growth. So if you read any blog post out there, if you talk to anyone in the startup ecosystem, the number one thing you'll hear about are different growth hacks, different acquisition hacks, basically ways that you can get more customers. Now the problem is, and kind of the thesis in talking about pricing, is that actually focusing on things like monetization and retention can be much better drivers of growth than simply focusing on getting more logos. But before I get into that data, first I want to show you just how focused we all are on acquisition. And the first data set we're going to look at for this is blog posts. So we studied blog posts for 2 particular reasons. One was because we write about what we know, and the other is because we write about what gets us clicks, right? So if we publish a blog post that's all about Facebook acquisition and a lot of people click on it, we're going to start writing more and more about acquisition and Facebook advertising in particular. Now what we found was pretty startling, or at least really fulfilled what our inklings were. And we found that most people, in fact, 8 out of 10 blog posts that are being written on growth right now are all about acquisition. About 1.5 out of 10 posts is written about retention. And then lo and behold, less than half out of every 10 blog posts is being written about monetization. And for better or for worse, most of those are being written by us at Price Intelligently. Now, what's really interesting about this is not just the extent of what we write about in the startup ecosystem, but also the type of products that we build. And what we did is we looked at about 8,000 SaaS companies and software companies, and we found a very, very similar trend, which was a little bit more startling. So almost 9 out of 10 of every company that we start is somehow focused on acquisition. Very, very few are focused on retention, and then there's like a dozen of us focused on monetization. It's like the saddest club in software, essentially. And what I wanted to do in this slide, because it looks very similar to the previous one, is I wanted to put together some logos just to kind of show you, like, here's all the acquisition companies, here's all the retention ones. But when I started doing that, I realized these are all of the acquisition companies. And I'm sure that a lot of you in this room that are focused on kind of B2B software are really, really focused on acquisition. But what was really, really interesting, or to kind of further go down this path, is that we talked to actual software founders and executives. And the first thing that we asked was, if you could focus on one thing, whether that's getting more logos, keeping those logos around longer, or making more money on each respective logo, where would you put your time? Where would you put your focus? And unsurprisingly, most said, we need more customers. We need more customers. That's what it was all about. We don't really care about keeping them around as long, and we don't necessarily care about making as much money per logo, but we need more and more logos. And we asked them similarly, if they had 100 units of time, where would they distribute that time across these 3 different functions in your business? And unsurprisingly, most said in acquisition as well. So the idea here is we think of acquisition as our oxygen. If you look at everything written about startups, everything written about growth, it's all about acquisition. What I'm here to talk about today is that acquisition is actually the least effective growth channel. So to kind of prove this out a little bit, it'll take me just a second to kind of explain this next model. What we did is we asked the question, if we improve each of these three levers by the relative same amount, what's the impact going to be on your bottom line? So if we improve acquisition by 1%, let's say we improve the number of leads we're getting by 1%, or just our conversion rate by 1%, the impact that we're going to see on average is about a 3% boost in your bottom line. Not bad, right? Now, if we improve our retention by 1%, meaning we keep that customer longer, we lower our gross churn by about 1%, you're going to see just under 7% boost in your bottom line. And as to not contradict my previous statements, if you improve your monetization by 1%, meaning you increase your price by 1%, you change the mix of your upsells by 1%, you're going to actually see just over 12% boost in your bottom line. So what's fascinating about this isn't necessarily the specific numbers, but the idea that focusing on retention or monetization actually produces 2 to 4x the impact of focusing on your acquisition. And what's interesting about this is, remember, the flow is just out of control with this thing. Sorry about that. But we want customers, but we don't really know what to do when we get them. That's the main thing that we should be thinking about with this data. We really, really want to get more logos. We want to acquire more customers. We want to get more folks through our funnels. But we're not really sure what to do when we get them in terms of how much we should charge them or really how we should keep them around for the long term. And the main reason for this is that we really, really don't know our buyers. If we were all really, really honest with ourselves, we probably didn't know or don't necessarily know to a very quantifiable level who we're selling to. Sure, we might know we're selling to developers or marketers or salespeople or consumers, but we don't actually know a really, really rich tableau of who we're selling to specifically. And so what I mean by that is we don't know what the most important features are to our buyer personas. We don't know who our least important features are to our buyer personas. We have no context on what their willingness to pay is. And ultimately, we're just brute forcing our growth by trying to acquire as many customers as possible and hoping that they stick around. I know it's not that dramatic, but it's one of those things where if you don't know your buyers to this level of detail, you're ending up wasting a lot of time in terms of cycles and probably losing a lot of money. But what's interesting about this is that when we talk to a lot of customers, and we talk to just a lot of users in the SaaS ecosystem, you guys aren't alone. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But most folks out there have thought about their buyer personas. You know something about your customer. It's not like you don't know anything about them. Very, very few of us have a central document that really dialogues what our customers are looking for. And then even fewer of us have this concept of a quantified buyer persona. And the reason this is pretty startling if you think about this next couple sets of data. We're not really talking to our customers. So we asked about 1,400 SaaS leaders and executives, how many customer development calls are you having per month? Meaning calls that are more just trying to get to what are the problems and causes that your customers are facing, and not necessarily about sales or really selling them something. And most of us are having very, very, very few calls. And this is in stark contrast to every piece of advice out there about building a company in the right way and actually going to your customer. And what's fascinating about this is that the excuse we hear from a lot of people who are doing very, very little calls is, well, we send surveys. We don't necessarily do one-on-one conversations, but we go gather a lot of data through intercom or through email or many other means. But the data kind of disproves that as well. Most of us aren't sending any surveys, let alone 1 or 2 per month. Then the other excuse I hear is, well, we test things. We do a lot of different experiments. We A/B test everything. Well, in reality, most of us aren't doing that either. And this data includes marketing tests as well. So what's interesting about this is that everything in your business, and why this is so scary, is that everything leads to this type of a pricing page. Now, it might not look like this. It might be a rate card. It might be an enterprise deal negotiation. It could be a number of things. But what's interesting is that if you don't know your buyers and you don't know who you're driving to this particular page, there's no way that you're going to be able to justify the price or justify the packaging or just justify the use of your particular product. It's that important to know who your buyers are, because everything that you do, from your sales or your marketing all the way to your operations and support, is used to either push someone to this purchasing decision or to make sure that when they get there, the purchasing decision is as no-brainer as possible. So how do we fix this? Now, the best way to kind of teach this, especially in kind of a time constraint here, is to use an example. And what I want to talk about today is how we can actually quantify these personas, and how we can get you to something that looks like this in your business, giving you a few tactics and tools that require very, very little software, very, very little expertise, but have really, really high impact. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to talk about my mom. So in particular, the fact that my mom's quilting business has better unit economics than any of your real businesses. So we all know what quilting is. Have we heard of quilting? Making blankets, sewing, that kind of thing. Well, this is my mom. She's really intense with this type of stuff. Her hobby, she's like a trade show marketer by day, but then at night she just sews and makes blankets, and my life is very weird and crafty with her, but it's really, really fascinating. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to help my mom essentially start a business so that she could retire early. And I wanted her to do something that she was passionate about, so we started essentially a Box of the Month club in the quilting space. So for those of you who don't know, Box of the Month clubs is essentially, in the States, they're all the rage right now, is you pay a certain amount per month, and then you basically get a box of whatever you're purchasing each month. So they make them for makeup, for food, all kinds of stuff. And before you laugh at the quilting business, I know it's kind of like folksy and a little weird. The quilting business is actually a $4 billion a year business. The average quilting household typically nets about $130,000 a year in household income, and they spend about $6,000 to $7,000 a year on quilting supplies. So a little bit weird, but a very, very lucrative industry. So what I did with my mom is, the first thing I did is I sat down with her and I said, listen, you know something about these buyers. You've been quilting for the better part of 40 years. She's older than that, but don't tell her I said a little bit about her age. But you know something about this industry. So if you were able to group your industry into different groups of buyers, what would you come up with? And this is kind of the stage that a lot of you guys are in. You know something about your buyers, but it's not down on paper. You haven't quantified it yet. You are kind of in the stage where you're kind of guessing and checking against your buyer. So the first thing we did is my mom came up with 5 different buyer personas. I'm going to show you 2 of them that we went through. But the first was Hipster Henrietta. This is a young, kind of lives in Brooklyn quilter. They like quilting because it's old and it's cool. Like, this person actually does exist, which is maybe sad or maybe cool, I don't know. And then Middle-Aged Mary, which is essentially where my mom is. She's getting a little into the granny age. But, I hope my mom never sees this. Anyways, but Middle-Aged Mary, who's a little bit older, quilting's kind of just a hobby because their mom or their grandma did it, and they started doing it when they were a kid. So what we did then is we went to the customer. And this is the biggest thing, and the biggest thing that you should be shocked by, the data that you saw previously, is that for the love of God, please talk to your customers. It is the single biggest factor that we have seen separate companies that fail and companies that are just absolutely crushing it, for the lack of a better phrase. And the way that we do this is really by using a couple of different statistical methodologies. I know that's a very scary phrase, but all we're doing is we're just going to these customers and asking them questions in the right way. And the tools that we're going to use basically follow this very, very simple model. You probably learned this kind of back in elementary school, but basically we're going to design our experiment. We're going to go collect some data. We're going to analyze the data and consolidate it down. And then we're just going to repeat this process over again. And I suggest you really start small, mainly because you can always ask more questions. But because you might not be used to this actual type of data collection, it's something where if you start really, really small, it's very, very likely you're going to do your second survey, your third survey, your fourth conversation with customers. And the tools we're going to use, or the data that we're going to collect, is on a couple of different axes. The first one is demographics. So this is really going to change depending on what type of business that you have. So for my mom's quilting business, which is essentially a consumer business, we want to know things like age, household income, how often they quilt. If you're selling to an enterprise type company, like a B2B type sale, you might want to know how much revenue they have, what their team size is, who they report to, things like that. But make sure it's really targeting towards your consumer. If age doesn't really matter to a B2B company that you're selling to, then don't waste your time asking about age. The next type of data that we're going to collect is this feature and packaging information. So basically, this just means, like, what do your customers want? Do they want single sign-on? Do they want analytics? Do they care about the color red versus the color blue? It's going to depend, again, on your different product, but it's something that you want to understand what they want in terms of packaging. And then finally, and ironically, probably the easiest data to collect is pricing data. And we'll show you that in just a sec after we talk through the packaging aspects. So the tools that we're going to use, we're going to teach you two today. One is called the relative preference analysis, and the other is price sensitivity analysis. I promise you they're very, very straightforward, but the names are a little jargony as we start off here. So the first part is, what do people value? So what does that packaging look like? So remember, if you look at any pricing page, and again, it doesn't necessarily look like this. It might be a contract, a rate card. It could be even simpler than this. It could be a physical product. But no matter what you're looking at, you have different aspects of your product that you can differentiate or just include in the core product. And then you have the actual price for that different packaging. So the first thing that we're going to attack is what features should go where, or if you're doing something that's more physical, like what features you should just include in your product in general. And the way that we're not going to do that is by asking questions like this. If you get anything from this presentation, never ask a question like this ever again. And the reason this question is so detrimental is that if you don't force people to make a decision, essentially what ends up happening is you get data that really, really doesn't grok with any directional information. So if we just ask people, hey, here's 5 features, here's 6 features, please rank all of them individually on a scale of 1 to 10, we're likely not going to be able to really tell what's important and what's not important. And even worse than that, if you're talking to certain consumers, you can almost guarantee that they're just going to say, oh, I want everything, especially if you don't give them a choice. So the way that we're going to do this and make this better is we're simply going to flip this on its head and say, out of these 4 or 5 features, what is the most important feature and what is the least important feature? And just with that simple switch and some really, really basic math, I'll share it with the slides if you download them or you can contact me to get them, all of a sudden you can change your data to look something like this. So for each of those features, now all of a sudden we know this feature is most important and that last feature is least important. But you also get magnitude. So now all of a sudden I could know that that first feature is 3 times as important as the second most important feature. And when I start to break this down on a demographic basis, all of a sudden I start to see these really, really cool trends between our different buyers. So here, I know that people who are a little bit wealthier, have higher household income, really, really like these 2 features and don't like those features, whereas those folks who have a little bit less household income are essentially in the reverse. And with that type of data, now all of a sudden you could start to differentiate those personas and ultimately start to target those customers in a different way and make sure that you're setting up your pricing in a proper way with different tiers and with different differentiation. And what's cool about this is as you collect more and more data, what you can use these tools for is not just one single question, but if you think about your products, you'll probably have a lot of different questions that you're going to want to ask, particularly comparing things like different support features, comparing different analytics features, comparing different colors, comparing all the things under the sun. And so basically what we recommend doing is setting up a categorical way that you can ask the main head question of something, so comparing things like your core features, your support, analytics, et cetera, and then adding additional questions to compare the different things in each of those categories. So for instance, we might have a question where we compare analytics, support, and different integrations. And we might find out that support is the most important thing. And then if we ask a separate support question around live chat, phone support, a forum, things like that, we might find that in that separate support data, all of a sudden people really, really want live chat. And what that allows you to do is all of a sudden you create this really, really rich tableau of data that allows you to show you what those different users want, and ultimately that can guide not only your pricing, but also your entire funnel from essentially looking at what features are important, what value propositions are important, and kind of the whole ball of wax. And so now we've basically filled in that first part of our buyer persona, essentially looking at what those most important features are and what those least important features are. And the next thing that we're going to look at here is essentially how much people are willing to pay. So as you'll remember, I mentioned that this is actually the easier thing to ask. It's a lot more straightforward, and it really predicates on what psychologists and economists have known about value in human beings for a long time. So when we look at a particular pricing page, or just any item in general, whether we're buying a cup of coffee or buying some sort of B2B software, we as human beings don't think about value as a single point. So if we were to ask you how much your laptop is worth to you, that's actually a really, really difficult question for you to answer, mainly because unless you've previously purchased a laptop or have something to compare it to, it's really, really hard to figure out like, oh, it's €1,000. Instead, what human beings think about value for is in a spectrum. So we know that that laptop isn't as valuable as a cup of water, and we both know that essentially those both items aren't as expensive as this entire hotel. And so what we can do is we can take advantage of that phenomenon by basically asking ranged questions. So in this particular instance, we can, instead of going point blank and asking someone what something's worth, we can ask them, well, at what price is that way too expensive? All the way down to, at what price is that too cheap that you question the quality of it? And if you're not sending a particular survey, if you're just in a conversation with a customer or a prospect, you don't have to use all 4 of these questions. Instead, you can simply ask, at what price is this way too expensive? And at what price is this a really, really good deal? Now, all of a sudden, you start to figure out, oh, this is kind of the range of the product that we're in. We're not a €10 product, we're a €100 product. And if you want to take this a step further and take the answers to these questions and do a little bit of basic math to them, you can get some output that looks like this. Now, what's important isn't necessarily kind of the numbers here on the right or these lines right here. The most important part is this actual elasticity curve here on the bottom. And what that essentially tells you is that if you move your price, let's say up €10, it'll show you how much conversion rate you'll actually lose or gain in a particular instance. And it'll also show you when your price is way too low. Because if I've learned anything about European software companies, they often price way too low for what they're offering, to the point that people actually question the quality of the product. And what's fascinating, you guys might not believe that, but I've seen it in the data. But what's fascinating about this is now what we've done with just a couple of questions, and I know it seems like a lot more questions than it actually is, but really with 3 or 4 questions, we've all of a sudden broken down these 2 particular personas in a couple of different ways that now you can settle a lot of internal arguments about your direction. You can actually figure out who might be the most profitable customer versus who's going to cost you a lot of money. And when you start to add in some other numbers, such as your actual kind of SaaS metrics, so the cost to acquire a customer, the lifetime value of a particular customer, and then even where those channels are in terms of where you can acquire those customers, all of a sudden your entire funnel starts to become really, really simple rather than you kind of guessing and checking to actually grow. And what's cool about this, in addition to kind of getting this data, is that this doesn't take a lot of time and money. So this whole project, in terms of basically quantifying those personas, took 8 hours total. And it cost $1,300. And that was basically because my mom didn't have 600 quilters to talk to. So we went out and purchased market panelists, basically purchased people to take our surveys. And what that allowed us to do is it basically took 6 months off my mom's business's trajectory. And I know there's kind of that classic build versus buy phenomenon, but oftentimes you can spend a relatively low amount of money and all of a sudden get huge impacts that you're not building the wrong thing, you're not marketing to the wrong customer, and ultimately you're pushing your business forward in the right direction. So again, start small, You can always ask more, you can always build more, you can always do a lot of different things, but if you're not used to doing customer development, you're not used to actually collecting good market data, start really, really small and then grow from there. And what I recommend doing is really implementing a pricing process in your business. No matter if you're really, really small or you're on your path to be a Fortune 2000 company, you really, really need to make sure that you're changing up your pricing about every 3 to 6 months. And the reason that this is so important is because if your product is improving, then your price should also be improving. Because remember, in the data that we previously saw, pricing has the biggest impact on your business in terms of your bottom line. So if you throw your prices out there in the first 6 months of your business, and then 5 years later you still haven't changed your pricing, and it happens all the time, unfortunately, you're missing out on a ton of value that you've already created. And it might actually be something where it's so hard to then change your pricing in the 5th year that you miss out on all the impact of actually getting the right dollar amount for your value. So in closing, all I want to say in terms of a kind of a cautionary tale is acquisition is something that's really important to your business, but it's not the only thing that's important. And what we've seen in all the data that we've had access to is if you're going to brute force your growth, you're very, very likely going to be left behind, mainly because it's getting harder and harder to acquire customers. So you need to make sure that you're keeping them around longer and ultimately making more money per customer. So here's my contact details. This is where you can download the slides with all the fun data. And in the appendix, we actually have some bonus data if you want to download it, just around churn rates and things like that for all those subscription companies out there. But I'm Patrick Campbell. I'm around here today, and I'm actually around tomorrow as well if you want to meet up, and more than happy to help.